After e4, c5, knight f3, d6, white comes with a check, bishop b5. In previous videos we went through bishop d7. We're still going to go through bishop d7 in future videos as well. There's lots of other things to show. The main move though we're going to cover in this video is knight to d7. This is the most popular option and the best move by black. White continues with d4 and the thematic opening up of the Sicilian. So we didn't go through d4 immediately like anyone will do in this case, like most players will do, because d4 is the main move to open up the game. But we have provoked knight d7, which otherwise would never arrived. So bishop b5 was key move in order to obtain the type of game we want. And now we're going to be learning what to do next. So after pawn takes, queen takes back. So white favors development, of course. We already have 3 pieces developed. 3 main moves we're going to go through. e6 attacking the bishop immediately, knight f6 developing, and e5 attacking the queen. They're all thematic. So let's start with a6. Now we take the knight. So we're already trading pieces and try to direct the game in our favorite type of setup. After bishop takes back, white castles. And after the logical and natural knight f6, white continues with rook to e1. So that's how the game will look like. White has placed the rook on the same file of the opponent king. Queen's already opened up in a file. There's nothing to worry in this situation because the knight in d7 was swapped by our bishop, so the knight will not be able to go to c6. There's no knight. The queen is absolutely fine in d4. She's perfectly comfortable in the center of the board. 2 main moves we're going to go through for this variation, the a6 variation, e5 and g6 idea of developing the dark square bishop. After e5, queen to d3. We're always going to stay on this file because we're going to be putting pressure on the backwards pawn. So the e5 move compromises the d6 pawn. He leaves it backward. Now, black continues with development of the bishop. Since the black player decided to play e5, that piece is going to develop the bishop this way. Otherwise, from g6, we will just create a lot of weakness over the dark squares. That would be silly. And now white goes on with bishop g5. So that's how the setup is going to look like. And we're going to take this knight. So we are trading pieces and we're going to have endgames easy to remember. After castling, for example, we take the knight. And now bishop takes back unless black wants to open up his own king, which will be good for us. And now logical development, knight to c3. This is going to be so easy to remember. If you watch this video a couple of times, that's going to be enough. Knight to c3, we're going to be applying target. The target will be this d6 pawn. Let's just remember that the queen b6 move in this type of scenario doesn't work to attack the vulnerable pawn because of knight d5 attacking the bishop. And also this pawn in b2 is not that good to take because the white player will be able to place rooks on the 7th rank afterwards. So if black were to retreat the queen now to d8, for example, then we will just go on with development. Rook 8 to d1 is the best move. And nothing's going to stop us from taking the pawn in d6 sooner or later. Well, very soon actually. So instead of queen b6, what about bishop going back to e7? This could lead to an idea such as f5 later on. White continue with d5. So let's look at this type of idea. Bishop to c6, attacking the knight, trying to get rid of this incredible knight. You're going to encounter this type of move a lot because this knight is going to be such a nightmare for black. White continues with c4. And if black takes, queen takes back. So yeah, we don't have our amazing knight anymore. And black thinks he might keep defending the pawn in d6 with these 2 dark squared pieces. But we'll see how to deal with that. Rook to c8 move, most active move by black, very logical, very typical in this situation, putting the rook on an open file, is met by b3. We're going to be supporting the pawns like this. And now it's all about keeping nerves of steel, just waiting for black to make a mistake. It's very difficult. It's like if we're already waiting for a Zugzwang. Let's see how to meet these potential moves. Like queen to c7 seems to be making sense. Potentially putting the rook on the file of the queen, control the open file a bit more, maybe look for a swap. White now continues with a4. It's important to stop the b5 pawn from arriving. We might not have our queen d5 protecting b5 for too long. So a4 now is a crucial move. And again, black to move. There are literally no moves. Let's look at potential idea of swaps. Queen to c6 is met by queen to d3. We need to keep our major attacking pieces like queen and rooks attacking the d6 pawn forever. That pawn will never push because we have c4 and e4 attacking that square. And our chain of light square pawns never has to worry about the black bishop, and we have too much attack with b5. There's no way for black to penetrate. After rook f to d8, for example, again, black just cannot push. Knight to d2 is the key move to protect the pawn in c4 a bit further and prepare pushing of the b pawn. After black's most active move, which is b5 now, the idea of opening the lines, white continues with rook e to d1. And now black's best move is to take the pawn in c4. This type of move like f5, an idea of maybe trying to break the white's control of the center by swapping maybe with the pawn in e4 and then transfer the rook on the file, doesn't work simply because we just win a clean pawn here in b5. And that also becomes a passed pawn. So after pawn takes, knight takes back. There's no way for black pawns on the queen side to annoy these two pawns. There's too much attack over d6. And white can even take his time and double up the rooks. Position is completely winning for white. Back in this position, we saw earlier queen to b6 idea doesn't work. Bishop to e7 to try and protect the pawn in d6 forever also doesn't work. Let's go through rook to c8 already. It's possible, and it's when the black player realizes also the passivity of such a setup and gives up the pawn in d6 for the opening of the lines. We take the pawn. This is just a free pawn. Ideas of bishop to g4, for example, trying to mess up the pawn structure and then conquer the file with the rooks, for example, is simply met by rook a to d1. We ignore this. It's not a problem because we're a clean pawn up. So the other idea could have been rook to c6 to attack the queen, win some tempos maybe, but then queen to d3. Again, we're just a pawn up. There's no compensation, but although it is quite popular to do that. How do we consolidate the advantage? After a move like b5, for example, again, the usual pattern. We're going to go and just conquer the file, rook a to d1. Two ideas right now. One of them is bishop to e6, stopping the knight from, just covering more the d5 square, because we know we're going to go there. Knight to d5 comes anyway. And again, we can just produce a passed pawn. Bishop to e7 is not possible since we're going to win another pawn in e5. So that pawn idea sacrifice is just a blunder. And let's look at this other scenario, like for example, if instead of bishop e6, black continues the attack on the knight, then we take the bishop. Queen takes back, rook takes back, we have a rook on the 7th rank, and then we give up the knight, but we're equally material, and now we just build this usual pawn chain, exploiting that black only has isolated pawns, where these two at least, c3 and a6, and we have nothing to worry on this side. Again, we're just a clean pawn up. And also we are threatening to take the pawn in a6 eventually, so we are forcing the rook to stay in the 6th rank. If black wants to try and remove the rook from the 7th rank, then simply white plays king to f1 in order to not have a weakness on the back rank anymore. And after attempt of rook swap, we simply do what's obvious, rook e to d1. And now we're threatening to just take the rook, because after all the swaps, then the pawn in e5 will be free as well. So after rook takes and rook takes, then that means that there was no way for black to remove our rook from the 7th rank. After rook to a8, maybe trying to protect the pawn. Let's close the line with rook to d5. And there's no way for black to save this pawn. After rook to e8, for instance, then king e2, we're just going to go and start grabbing more material. Let's make a recap. We check with the bishop in b5 and knight d7, then we attack the center. After pawn takes, we take with the queen, so we don't take with the knight. And we're looking at this move, a6. So we take the knight, first swap, bishop takes back, and now white castles. Knight f6, rook to e1. Very smooth development. We've already gone through e5 and this how to exploit this setup. We're going to go through another one, which is g6. The bishop will try to go on a fianchetto. White continues with the very natural knight to c3, and then after bishop to g7, white pushes the pawn in e5. We're going to look at two options, knight to g4, which puts more attack over e5, and pawn takes. Knight to g4, especially exploiting the fact that this pawn is pinned, otherwise the bishop will take the queen, is met by bishop to f4. If pawn takes pawn, that's not a problem. White takes back with the knight. Let's quickly mention three options. Knight takes, we can take, and then bishop takes, and then queen takes, with applying pressure on the rook and also on e7. So that's not good for black. So black will have to castle, and now knight to d5, threatening knight e7, winning the game immediately. And this is already unstoppable because e6 is just very stupid. So after bishop to e6, which kind of blockades the whole thing, knight to c7 attacking the rook, and after rook c8 we can take the bishop, and then pawn takes back, we can win a pawn, check, and after the most active rook to f7, also in order to cover the square e7 a bit more, rook a to d1, very natural development. Black has got black is one pawn down and the pawn is isolated as well, so it's a winning endgame. After queen goes back to c7, c3 in order to secure this pawn chain and never worry anymore. And after the only attempt by black, maybe place the rook on support of the other rook in f7 and then move the king to make these pieces active. White continues with rook to d7 with an attack on the queen and putting more attack on e7. And after the last desperate move, queen to f4, going for this square f2, white plays pawn to f3, there's nothing to worry, no checks. And after queen to f6, only desperate move to avoid disaster. White ignores that and just plays rook to b7, winning more material and going to win the endgame. So back at this position, after e5, and we're looking at knight to g4. This is met by bishop f4. Let's mention that f6 here doesn't make sense because pawn takes pawn here. The pawn in e7 is pinned and it's just a free pawn and it comes with a deadly attack. We're still looking at this move, pawn takes pawn. And now, as we said, we take with a knight. We went through knight takes. What happens if bishop takes? Then bishop takes back. Then attack on the rook. And after castling, white continues with the usual knight to d5. So this is so easy to remember. Again, threats of knight e7, moving the bishop away with the threat of the queen, going for a checkmate in g7 whilst the rook attack the queen. So many threats are happening here. Bishop to e6 to blockade everything. In this case, that could also look like a potential attempt. And now bishop to h8, threatening checkmate in g7. f6 cannot be played to stop that because rook takes bishop for free. So after a move that looks normal like knight to f6 to stop the checkmate threat is met by knight takes e7. And now if king takes bishop, then the queen going to f6 will be deadly. After queen takes knight, bishop takes knight with an attack on the queen. The queen has to move, but where? Wherever the queen, let's say queen to d7 and queen f4, and this is going to be checkmate soon. And if queen to c7 to cover the square f4, where we're planning to go and target the weak squares, weak dark squares, then simply queen to e3 will do. Again, in this position, after the e5 move and knight to g4, we play bishop to f4, and after pawn takes, knight takes, what happens if black just castles, so doesn't take in e5? Well, queen to d7 wins the bishop. This leads us to do the last recap. So after d6, check, knight d7, we attack the center, take with the queen, a6, we take the knight, take the bishop, we castle, knight f6, rook to e1, and after g6, knight c3, very normal development. And after bishop g7, e5, attacking the knight. So what happens if black simply takes in e5, with avoiding all of that mess that happened before? Take back with the knight. And after finally castling, it looks like black has reached a normal game, but now knight takes, and we have an attack on e7. After queen takes back, we can take, knight takes, rook takes e7, and after rook a to d8, defending the knight, also stopping the rook from potentially going to b7. That's just the move as an example because in this situation the black player just blundered the pawn. There is no compensation for black. So now king to f1, saving the king from potential back rank mate threats. Let's quickly look at two moves before closing this line. Rook f to e8, looking for swap, is met by rook takes, and then knight to d5. This may look like one of those annoying endgame where you only up a pawn and you're scared that you will lose that tiny advantage that you have or that the opponent will find a way to equalize. But the thing is that this knight here cannot be removed by this square. White can start pushing the pawns on the majority here. After c3, this pawn chain will be completely safe and the bishop will be good to go. And after the rook comes into the game, white should be able to win. Yeah, it is impossible for me to go through the trillions of possible moves that can happen now because it's an open endgame. But the advantage is solid, and with careful play, you should be able to make it easily. In this situation, again, if black doesn't look for the trade and just plays bishop to e7, bishop f6 attacking the rook, then simply the rook goes back on a light square, of course. And after potential idea like king to g7, approaching down and still avoiding swaps in order to keep pieces on the board, especially because black is down material. Knight to e4, attacking the bishop. And after bishop to e7, bishop to d2. That's how the white player will continue the endgame. Again, we're going to have to stop the line here. We have achieved what we wanted. We just wanted to go to an endgame, transition to a winning endgame. And that's where we are. The idea of the white player also here could be bishop to c3 with the check, and then bring the rooks on an open file and doubling them up. So let's make some example moves. Knight to c5 is met by bishop to c3 check, and after f6, bishop to b4 comes now. Double attack on the knight. Knight takes e4 is not possible because bishop to e7 attacks both rooks, so it wins material. And after rook to c8 instead, white continues with rook to d1, and it's just going to win because of the possibility to place the rooks in the 7th rank sooner or later, or just winning the swaps. So white will always have this idea of swapping everything, maybe after c3, depending on how black plays, and then place the rook in the 7th rank. After f5, attacking the knight, and knight to d6. Nothing to worry after takes. White's advantage is considered more than satisfying here.